Good day, everyone, and welcome to today's EDF webinar, Natural Gas, Reducing Risk to Public Health and the Environment. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Later, you will have the opportunity to ask questions during the question and answer session. You may register to ask a question at any time by pressing the star and 1 on your touchtone phone. You may withdraw yourself from the queue by pressing the pound key. Please note this call may be recorded. I will be standing by if you should need any assistance. It is now my pleasure to turn the conference over to Mr. Mark Brownstein. You may begin.
Thank you, operator, and good afternoon to those of you out there in Radio Land and to the folks here in California. I'm Mark Brownstein. I am Associate Vice President of the U.S. Climate and Energy Program, and I'm joined here by Steve Hamburg, who's our Chief Scientist, and we're here today to talk about natural gas, reducing the risks to public health and the environment. And of course, the first question is why are we talking about natural gas at all, right? We are an environmental organization. Shouldn't we be here talking about efficiency and renewables and clean technology? And yes, absolutely, we should be. And maybe you all have had the opportunity to participate in similar types of sessions where we have talked about exactly those things. Much of our climate and energy work is oriented around clean energy and renewable technologies and energy efficiency. Jim Marston, Cheryl Roberto are all spending a lot of time working on that. But we're here today to talk about natural gas because natural gas, first of all, permeates our current energy economy. It is a major source of energy, whether you're talking about electric generation or how we heat our homes or how we cook our food. It's a major input to industrial processes. It pervades our energy economy today. And of course, you all know from reading the newspaper that we've seen a step change in our ability to produce natural gas here in the United States because of the technological innovation associated with hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling and some other innovations in the industry. And so we have more natural gas today than we ever thought we would. And there are, in fact, some environmental upsides to this. Natural gas is helping us to chase coal out of the electricity sector. That's a good thing. Natural gas has half the carbon content of coal. And so on the face of it, it burns cleaner. So there are some near-term tangible reasons why natural gas is better than coal, and the fact that it's helping us to chase coal out in the marketplace is a good thing. Natural gas can also be part of the strategy of helping to integrate renewables into our electric grid, and we can talk more about that during the question and answer session. But it's also fair to say that with those upsides come some very significant environmental challenges. Right? Probably the biggest one is the fact that natural gas is methane, primarily methane, and methane is a powerful greenhouse gas, and Steve Hamburg will spend quite a bit of time talking about about the science of this and how we've come to understand this and what therefore we need to start doing about it. But of course, if you live in one of the communities where gas is being produced, right, your more immediate concern is what is the impact of this gas production on my environment? What is the impact on air and community? And most importantly, water. Right? I don't have to tell anyone here in California how important water is. Right? You don't appreciate it until you don't have it. Okay? And in many communities around the country, right, natural gas is a challenge to not only the supply of water, but water quality. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the work that we are doing there. You see our emphasis on natural gas permeating our new 5-year strategic plan. I hope that you all have had a chance to see this, and if not, we can make sure that you get a copy of our Blueprint 2020 every 5 years. EDF puts pen to paper and thinks about what we need to be working on over the next 5 years. Our plan reflects the fact that we know that methane is a big issue, and we're taking aggressive action to address it. We know that air pollution is a big issue, and we're taking aggressive actions to address it. And water supply and water quality, big issue. We're taking aggressive actions to address it. Today's conversation is about what we're doing to make these goals a reality. So with that, let me turn it over to Steve, who can talk about the science of methane.
Thanks very much, Mark, and I want to again also welcome people here in the room as well as those on the phone. I want to also say that if you have questions, clarifying questions while I'm talking, feel free to indicate. Also those on the phone, if you want to ask a question, please do for clarifying, and then we're going to keep our remarks, Mark's and mine, to roughly 20 minutes so that the majority of the time can be for questions and answers. As we think about, as Mark mentioned, methane, it's a really important part of the climate story. Methane is a short-lived climate pollutant. It is very powerful in affecting the climate. So when a kilogram of methane is emitted into the atmosphere, it's going to have 120 times more impact on the net radiative forcing, the amount of energy that's trapped, than would a kilogram of CO2. However, methane breaks down in the atmosphere far more quickly than does CO2. So the graph that I'm showing now shows you, if you go over to the left side to the fraction remaining, we start with 100%. The CO2 will actually not break down, but it'll be absorbed by the oceans and by the forests of the world, so that roughly after 100 years, 40% of that CO2 you emit is still around. And the problem is 200 years, it's about 40% as well, and 300 years. So it basically, it's what doesn't react right away with the biosphere, stays up in the atmosphere for a very long time. Methane, by contrast, does react in the atmosphere relatively quickly, converted into CO2, and by 50 years, most of it's gone. But over those first 50 years, it's having an enormous impact on the climate. So the opportunity to reduce methane emissions allows us to slow the rate of warming, and I'll come back to this point. But so how much is being emitted and what influence? Mark mentioned that there is an opportunity to use natural gas to displace coal or other fuels because it is the most compact, lowest carbon content fossil fuel that exists. So if you want to get the most energy with the least carbon, natural gas, methane, is your best option that exists. So it's the last step to renewables. If we go starting with wood to coal to oil to natural gas, that's the last step before we can get to renewables. And that's our goal. We've got to get to renewables. So it's the most compact fuel. So how much can we emit? So the graph that I'm showing you here on the y-axis is the percent of gas emitted through the production and distribution of natural gas. So you go to the well, you're producing it, you know, it's gas, so some of it leaks out. Not because somebody wants it to, it's product, but it does. So how much is emitted is not well understood, though we're getting to understand it better. So we looked at, well, how much emissions would have to be happening before the advantage of going from, let's say, coal in electrical generation to natural gas would offset those benefits. And so we created this curve. Here it says 2.7%. So basically, if less than 2.7% of the gas is lost before it gets burned to generate that electricity, relative to coal, we're going to have a net benefit for the climate from day one in making that switch. But if there were 5% emissions, so 5% of the gas produced somewhere along the way got emitted to the atmosphere, it would take roughly 50 years before we see the climate benefit. Well, we believe that you can actually reduce emissions down to 1% and make fuel switching benefit for the climate at all points in time, and we can realize the vision of actually moving to a lower carbon economy with immediate impacts. And what does this mean for the climate? So I'm going to show a set of graphs that came from a paper roughly published a year ago by a group out of Harvard that sort of builds this idea of what could it mean to reduce methane, which is the most potent and the most ubiquitous of the short-lived climate pollutants, relative to just doing CO2. So if we think about this graph I'm showing is how much is business as usual now going to affect the climate over the next 200 years. Now this is not with no change. This includes some of the things we're already doing to reduce climate change. And so if we do that, you see it doesn't go on endlessly because they'll start to have effect. But we're going to see a world that is not a pretty place, and it won't, you know, for my great-grandchildren in a couple hundred years, 4 degrees Celsius, almost 8 degrees Fahrenheit change would be an extremely different place, likely would be a very inhospitable place to many people in many regions, including producing enough food. So what can we do about it? Well, if we reduce the emissions of methane, which is the dominant short-lived forcer, the work that they did at Harvard shows, particularly if we look at the left side, and we see that that yellow line, how much slower the rate of increase occurs. That's because we've got this potent greenhouse gas that accounts for 1/4 of the climate warming we're experiencing today. 1/4 of all of the current climate comes from methane alone, not even the other short-lived, from methane. And 50% of the impacts that we as humanity will have, will experience over the next 20 years from the emissions we put up this year. So just think about this year's emissions, 50% of the impact we experience over the next 20 years, which is a good part of what's left in my lifetime, will be because of methane alone, 50%. So this is a big lever for reducing the rate of climate change. But if you see over the long term, the future is still pretty darn scary. We've still got a lot of climate change. So it helps us in the short term to slow the rate, critically important to reduce those impacts, but not sufficient. Whoops, went too far. So then if we look at CO2 alone, if we only focus on CO2, what you see is it doesn't help us much in the short term, over the next 50 years, but it does bring it down quite a ways in the future. When we combine them, we get the power that we're looking for, because we care about two things: reducing the rate of warming today, and that's sort of what matters for us and our children. What matters for our grandchildren's grandchildren is the CO2. We got to do both. We're focused on methane and the natural gas infrastructure because it allows us to do both of those quickly and having a massive impact on the rate of climate forcing. What have we been doing at EDF? Because the understanding of where this methane was coming from, how much was leaking, was not well understood. Roughly 3 years ago, we started a series of 16 studies that I have the privilege of directing that allowed us to try and quantify methane emissions in the U.S. from across the natural gas supply chain with a host of different partners from both the corporate sector and academics. So we have more than 50 academic partners. We have hundreds of academic scientists working with us, more than 50 corporate partners. Together, we have done 16 studies. These are just a list of the studies across the supply chain from the left, from production to gathering and processing, to transmission and high power, local distribution, pump to wheels, how it gets used in transportation, and also looking things with planes. EDF now has a fleet of planes. We don't own them, but we in a way charter them. We've got people flying around making measurements. Together, that's given us a much clearer picture of where the emissions are, and importantly, where the mitigation opportunities coexist. So how can we reduce the emissions to maximize the benefits of natural gas and minimize the negative impacts of it? And just to illustrate that, these leaks out there, if we look at the left-hand picture, we see two tanks on a drilling pad, and there's up here on the left-hand corner, you can actually see the well. It's not a very imposing after they pull away the drilling rig. And they're storing liquids that are produced as a byproduct. And you look at it, it looks all fine. But that's using visual, in the visual spectrum, what we can see with our eyes. But if we look at the infrared spectrum and take the same picture, what you see are these big plumes coming out of it. That's methane. The tanks are leaking. So the key here is, how do you reduce this using what's referred to as leak detection and repair? The mechanisms of reducing those emissions, saving product, reducing air pollution, reducing this potent climate pollutant, and having a win-win for everybody involved. And another place we've looked at is we've mapped the urban environment. We developed the science to map leaks in the infrastructure, in the streets, and the places we live, and do that in a way that we can actually quantify how much gas is leaking. That had never been done before. We're doing this work jointly with a partner here in Silicon Valley, Google Earth, and Google, through their Street View cars, drove instruments around. We developed the algorithms with our academic partners and then mapped cities. We've done 5 have been released so far. We've got several more about to be released, and where the goal is to map the country and create for the first time publicly available data so we can understand the implications. And a good example is this is Boston on the left that shows a very high density of leaks because they have very old infrastructure. On the right is Indianapolis that replaced their pipes over the last 20 years, and as a result of that investment have very low numbers of leaks. These are, we can reduce the leaks, we know how to do it, we need to have the conviction regulations to do that. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Mark. And again, if there are any questions for clarification, please speak up. Or, yeah, one question here in the room. Go ahead.
For that last slide for the infrared camera, are any regulators using that same type of visual? I know it might be state-specific, but how is the state regulated?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm going to repeat the question for those on the phone. The question was, are state regulators using the infrared cameras to see these kinds of leaks as indicated by the slide that I have up now? And the answer is absolutely yes. But the level of that work, the number of inspectors, is not sufficient to ensure that these things, when they do happen, are fixed quickly. So one of the things that we're doing is working actually with the private sector through something we call the Methane Detectors Challenge to develop new technology that allows you to, on every well pad, have sensors that can basically are equivalent, I like to refer to them as smoke detectors or carbon monoxide, right? They go off and tell you there's an upset. And there's a critical point here. They can't go off too often because what do? You take the battery out. So they have to go off when there's really a problem. And so we actually have corporate partners who are going to be field testing these. And the key here is they're demonstrating there's a market. So they're saying, you produce this kind of technology, we'll buy it and deploy it because we too don't want to see these upsets. We don't want to see these problems.
Those of you who follow who follow our work. Now go back to the thingamajig. Okay.
You can tell he's a scientist, thingamajig.
That's a technical term. All right. But those of you who follow our work may know that last year we were successful in getting a landmark set of regulations enacted in Colorado, right, that for the first time regulate all hydrocarbons coming from oil and gas production, including methane. Okay. One of the centerpieces of that landmark set of regulations is a requirement that companies do periodic leak detection and repair, right? You can't manage what you don't measure. And a lot of these facilities, right, if you drive around, are out in the middle of nowhere and very often are not staffed, okay? And so a condition like this can exist for some period of time before anyone thinks to even go out to the site, much less aim an infrared camera to see if there's a problem. So Colorado's regulations now require facilities to do periodic leak detection and repair, aim the camera at the site, all right, and then take action if you see something.
And one of the things we think of natural gas in our own lives as having an odor. But that's because we actually place an odorant when it gets to the local distribution. So when you see these kinds of methane leaks happening on well pads, you can't smell it, and you'll have no indication unless, in the case this is raw gas, there may be some things in it that smell. So it's not as easy to understand it's happening than you might think.
Okay, so we got 2 questions in the room here.
Yep. Go ahead.
Is methane the only gas that's coming out of these wells?
It's not the only thing. It varies by the play. It's the dominant gas coming out. There'd be associated hydrocarbons generally, and there might be some hydrogen sulfide depending on where it is. But the advantage is if you prevent the methane from coming out, you're preventing all those air pollutants from coming out.
And I should say there is more advanced technology that is being developed that essentially can do color coding, right? So you can get a color picture and be able to better speciate the kind of gas that's coming from the tank based on that coloring.
But that's expensive, and that's not applicable to the hundreds of thousands of wells. So
Right.
what we want to do is get the science to be practical.
And how, you say periodically
Yes.
they look at them. What's periodically?
Okay, great question. So in the case of Colorado, the largest facilities have to do monthly inspection. There's a second tier of facilities that have to do it on a quarterly basis. And then the smallest facilities are basically an annual requirement.
So it has to do with the size?
Has to do with the size, okay? And the value of the work that Steve and our corporate partnership group doing to pioneer the new detectors is that rather than wait for someone to go out to the site with a camera, a site like this would be equipped with one of those detectors, might cost $1,000, okay, and would sit, you know, at the perimeter and would go off if there was elevated emissions. And it would be,
To a computer?
and it, right, it could go back to the home office, okay? Just as this well, okay, this well is connected by telemetry back to a home office somewhere that's keeping track of how much it's producing. So it's the same technology that they use to monitor its production would now be used to monitor any emissions.
And again, it was just harnessing the market. Pieces were there, but they hadn't been brought together. Larry?
It's a good time to ask about the what EPA is doing in terms of methane leakage.
Let's get there.
Okay.
Why don't we move to, so this is what we've been doing to better understand the challenges, pioneering new ways of looking at this, okay? But we aren't waiting to have all of the answers. We aren't waiting to have perfect information before we're taking action now to address the problem. Colorado regulations are a good example of that. Last year, we commissioned ICF International, which is a major consulting group, to basically do a survey. Everything that we know about emissions from the oil and gas sector, everything we know about technologies capable of controlling these emissions, everything we know about work practices that can be used, and their costs. And ICF concluded that we can make a 40% reduction in the amount of methane coming from the oil and gas industry today for a penny per 1,000 cubic feet of gas produced. Right? Those of you who follow the gas price know it sells for about, right now, about $3, let's say?
Yeah.
$3 a 1,000 cubic feet, because we're talking about a penny, to make a 40% reduction. 40% of the reduction opportunities available to industry have a net payback to industry. In other words, they can make money reselling the gas. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that every opportunity is a money maker, right? Those of you who are investors know that there are hurdle rates for capital, okay? But the point is that there is a return, some return on investment. 60% of the opportunities will actually cost the companies, right? But the good news is that much of the reduction opportunities don't entail having to change out new pieces of equipment. It really has to do with things like leak detection and repair, leak detection and repair, leak detection and repair. For those of you at home, right, these blue bars, if you're looking at the blue bars on your PowerPoints, you see LDAR, 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 okay? So a lot of this is just sending people out with the cameras, survey the sites, better operation and maintenance, right? What we often say is this is not rocket science, this is auto mechanics, okay? This graph was critical to convincing the Obama administration to, this past January, announce a reduction goal for the U.S. oil and gas industry, 40 to 45% over the next 10 years. And the Environmental Protection Agency and the Bureau of Land Management are each now starting regulatory processes to begin to implement rules that get us at least part of the way to achieving that goal. A lot of the work that we are going to be doing in the next 5 years is making sure that those regulations get proposed and adopted, and that we continue to work with EPA, Bureau of Land Management, and other agencies to get the rest of the possible reductions through additional rulemaking. And this will be a challenge. Okay, we do not have a Congress right now which is particularly favorable towards new regulatory. We continue to keep working on state-level initiatives. So another thing that we are currently working on is the state of Pennsylvania. We have a new administration there. Many people don't realize Pennsylvania is now the second largest gas-producing state in the United States, second only to Texas. Okay, there's a governor who we have convinced to make reducing methane emissions part of his agenda. And so there is a campaign that we are engaging in to get Pennsylvania to adopt a set of regulations very similar to Colorado's. This will not only be good in its own right, but we think it helps create political momentum to do what needs to be done at the federal level. But our work is not just focused in the United States. The oil and gas industry is a global industry. Okay? This map here shows you, the red dot shows you estimates of where we think emissions are. Now, there is very poor information about methane emissions globally. And during questions and answers, Steve can talk to you about some of the work that we are beginning to do with researchers at Harvard to use satellite technology to do a better job of quantifying methane emissions globally. But here again, we think we already know enough to know that, for example, in North America, Canada, United States, and Mexico by themselves, 20% of global methane emissions from the oil and gas industry. So if we take what we're doing in the United States and expand it to all of North America, very important down payment to addressing this issue at a global level, just by working in our own backyard. There are some parts of the world that we likely are never going to be able to touch in terms of work with governments. Iran, for example, we're not going there anytime soon. But we do have the ability to put pressure on the international oil companies that are the main producers in these countries to get them to commit to measuring, reporting, and reducing. And in fact, this past September at the United Nations, we helped launch a project to do just that. First step, not everything we need to do, but it's a first step towards getting the international oil and gas community engaged in this issue and making reductions. Finally, I said, right, the challenge here is not simply about methane, right? For the communities where production is taking place, the number one concern is water. And increasingly, both here in the United States and globally, water supply and water quality is becoming an issue every bit as important as climate change, in part because of climate change. So there are two things that we can and must protect groundwater from unconventional oil and gas development. The first is we must make sure that anything that goes up and down the well, right, whether it's the chemicals used in hydraulic fracturing or it's the hydrocarbons that are coming back up, that they remain isolated from the surrounding water supply. Okay? That is a set of regulations that are called well integrity regulations. We wrote a model regulatory framework that now has been the basis of the state of Texas, completely rewriting their well integrity requirements based on our model regulatory framework. We have seen a 40% decline in well blowouts this past year as a result of those new regulations. So we know that it can make a difference. The other thing that we need to do to protect groundwater is to reduce the risks associated with how the groundwater is handled at the surface. Right? Many of you have read in the newspapers about earthquakes associated with hydraulic fracturing. Right? Much of that seismic activity is associated with how we currently dispose of the wastewater. We inject it into geologic formations. Okay? What we're learning is that that's becoming increasingly untenable. And so many in the industry are now looking at water treatment and discharge of treated water to water bodies as an alternative to that injection process. But what we're finding is that we understand very little about what's in this wastewater. And if we don't understand what's in the wastewater, we don't really have a good handle on the kinds of technologies that we need or how clean we have to make that water. Okay? And what we're also learning is that even with treatment technologies, we have to think about the residual waste materials that are produced through treatment. So, we are now engaged in starting a process, much like we did with methane 3 years ago, to better understand the wastewater cycle, what's in it, and what are the opportunities to make a material difference in improving this so that we can take necessary steps to protect wastewater.
Just a question.
Sure.
Do the companies that put this wastewater out there, do they consider what's in it intellectual property like they do with they don't do?
No, so the wastewater is not intellectual property, but it is complicated, very complicated chemistry. So one of the keys is how can we characterize it adequately, rapidly, and effectively in the sense of knowing how to deal with it. Because there are different kinds of things in the wastewater. There are radionuclides that come back up out of the hole. There's lots of salts. There's lots of heavy metals, but it varies by place. There's, of course, hydrocarbons. There are the things that went down the hole as part of the fracturing, et cetera. So it's how can you characterize that and then develop effective treatment approaches.
And in fact, one of the things that we've learned is that, you know, this is pressure and this is temperature. And so there are chemical reactions that occur, right, as a consequence of the process itself.
So the water you start putting down is very different when it comes back up out of the hole. And I wouldn't say the chemicals going down aren't important, but we have to think of it as a much bigger problem, bigger issue. And this is not new just to this is an issue that's been going on for a long time. Those wells that were described where you inject it were developed over a long period of time. It's just we're now producing more of it, so the problem has become more acute. We have a question on the web.
We do, and I also want to remind people participating by phone, if you want to ask a question, you can hit *1 on your touchtone phone, or if you want to type it in the dialog box in the lower right-hand corner, that would be great. This question is from Lainey Thornton. Forbes had an article on Rebellion Photonics, which observes spectroanalysis which is superior to just infrared. Is this technology being used effectively?
Rebellion, yes. So Rebellion Photonics is one of the companies that is working on technology to do this methane detection that we were talking about. All right? And the photonics technology has the ability, okay, to do what we call speciation, to be able to look at this plume and not just see it in black and white, but be able to help us better characterize how much of this, what percentage of this is methane, what percentage of this might be another hydrocarbon, is a certain percentage of this water vapor.
Yeah.
In hydraulic fracturing, what percentage of the water that goes down comes back up, right? As opposed to a lot of it may just sit in among the rocks. So.
Well, you have to think there's really two parts to that. So the question was what proportion of the water that gets injected as part of the fracturing process comes back up? And you have two processes. So what comes back up right immediately, but also what is being produced over the life of the well. And so of the water that's used in the actual hydraulic fracturing, it varies again by play, but roughly 20% will be coming back up immediately in what's called the completion, or I like to refer in vernacular, the burp. You've got to sort of clean that stuff out. And there now is required by EPA regulations that do something called reduced emission completions, which ensures that you're not emitting a lot of gas while you're cleaning that well out to allow it to produce. But then it keeps producing liquids. Again, it varies from place to place throughout the life of the well. And that can be a sizable amount of liquids that you have to deal with.
The rock, right, you have to think of it this way, right? This rock is organic material, right? And that's why there are hydrocarbons there. Okay, so trapped in this rock may also be, right, for lack of a better term, ancient seawater, okay, ancient water molecules, that as the hydrocarbons are liberated, right, there are water molecules that are liberated as well, and that's what is produced water. The Chinese, for example, are finding that the vast majority of water that they inject down the hole doesn't come back up. They don't know why. Okay, and that's one of the things that they're working on. I'm going to China in the beginning of April, right, as part of an International Energy Agency workshop on hydraulic fracturing in China, and this is going to be one of the central questions that will be discussed.
We have a question on the phone.
We do. We'll take our question from Douglas Bample. Your line is now open.
Oh, thank you. I have in front of me the annual report of Schlumberger, and in connection with your mentioning international work, I found it interesting that page 1 of the annual report is devoted to safety and environmental performance and carbon emission reporting.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So for those of you,
and it does refer to participating in something called the Carbon Disclosure Project since 2005.
Yes. So Douglas, for the benefit of those of you who may not be familiar with who Schlumberger is, right, most of the international oil and gas companies, Exxon and right, Statoil and all the names that you may have heard of, usually contract with third parties to do much of the drilling and hydraulic fracturing work, and Schlumberger is probably one of the leading companies in that space. Okay, so they're the contractor. They're the ones drilling this well and doing the hydraulic fracturing. Okay, and they, what Douglas, I think what you're seeing is an increasing awareness that methane emissions are an important attribute of what they need to be managing for. Right? Until we started doing this work 2.5, 3 years ago, the industry really paid very little attention. The general assumption was that, you know, as a matter of course, we take care not to waste the product that we're producing. Of course, what we're finding through our studies is that there are plenty of opportunities to reduce emissions. Schlumberger, I think, is now signaling that. The Carbon Disclosure Project is a long-standing project to get companies to report on their carbon dioxide emissions. And in fact, we're in conversations with the Carbon Disclosure Project to add methane emissions as another component of what companies would report on to give a fuller picture of a company's greenhouse gas profile.
And one other thing I'd add on that, one of the keys here is, again, I mentioned what I refer to as the and proposition, worrying about what's happening in the short-lived forcers, so what happens over the next few decades, as well as what happens in 100 years. We have to create that accountability in both of those and differentiate. Right now, we're pushing it all together, and it creates a very murky picture on how we can proceed most effectively to truly reduce the climate impacts of our activities. By bringing and separating these, really talking about them as separately, not substituting one for the other, but an and, we really can maximize the benefits that we see from our actions today. The graphs I showed you are to try and illustrate that. It's really, you get bang out of both. If you just try and blur them, you don't get that. So,
just to follow up, does the Carbon Disclosure Act have a lot of participants, or is it pretty limited to a few leading companies?
The Carbon Disclosure Project, actually, over the years, it's been around since 2005, and each year there are new companies that are participating. Offhand, I don't know, but it has generated a fair amount of support. What we're finding is the investor community increasingly is looking at Carbon Disclosure Project information to try to figure out what the greenhouse gas liability is of companies that investors either are looking at investing in or currently have investments in. It's a very useful, and there's a whole website, Douglas, so if you really want to dive deep on that, I encourage you to visit their website. It's quite informative. Let's take a question from the room.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Your water quality diagram here clearly refers to hydrofracking. But if you look at the water quality and the methane leakage issue, isn't it also a problem for conventional and tertiary recovery of oil and gas? And what percentage of the total leakage and water quality problems relate from hydrofracking versus what I'll call conventional oil and gas recovery?
So just to repeat, I'm not sure if everybody on the phone could hear it. The question was, to what degree is this just an unconventional development, oil and gas, meaning hydrofracking and horizontal drilling, as well as a conventional oil and gas production, and the fact that it's across the whole sector? Do you want to start?
Yeah, so it's a great question, right? And I often have to remind people, right, that when we talk about the methane emission from the oil and gas industry, right, this is not an issue that is unique to unconventional oil and gas development. This is not an issue that's unique to hydraulic fracturing, right? This is an issue that permeates the entire oil and gas industry. Conventional, unconventional, onshore, offshore, right? And this is not just about the well site. This is also about the gathering and processing infrastructure, right? The pipes that take all this gas from the various wells and collect it. The interstate pipeline systems that carry the gas from one part of the country to another. The infrastructure that then takes that gas and delivers it to our homes and our businesses, right? So this is a much bigger issue than hydraulic fracturing. The reason why we're talking about this now is, frankly, though, because we are producing so much more oil and gas in the United States as a result of hydraulic fracturing that it really has brought this issue into sharp relief. The other point that I would make is that well integrity, too, is not simply an issue of hydraulic fracturing. Well integrity is important for conventional, right? We all remember the Macondo incident out in the Gulf, right? What caused that accident? A loss of well integrity, okay? So well integrity is a critical path for protecting groundwater for any kind of oil and gas development. But again, the reason why we're talking about it now is because we're doing so much more of it than we ever did in the past.
But I also want to add is all of the studies that we're coordinating are the entire supply chain. So we're looking at oil and gas on the production side. It's focused more on unconventional, but it also includes some conventional, all the way through to the local distribution, as I said. One of the studies that was released now 2 months ago looked at the total loss of methane from natural gas in Boston, in the Boston region. So it's not just this downtown city, but the Boston region. They found 2.7% loss rate just at that end of the supply chain. And if you remember on the gas to coal conversion, that's the magic number. So in that case, it's above it. It doesn't mean that there still isn't advantages of converting. It's just they're delayed down the line from coal to gas in that region. And that has old infrastructure. So we have looked at the entire supply chain for exactly the reason you say. It's a system problem. We can't just slice off one piece and expect to understand it. We have a question from the web.
We do. This is a question from Ed Norton. Are there limits to the Clean Air Act and state laws on methane emissions?
I'm going to turn it to the lawyer, not the scientist, to answer that one.
So the simple answer is that under the Clean Air Act, right, methane is a greenhouse gas pollutant. There was a legal decision a number of years ago called Mass v. EPA, which basically established the fact that the Clean Air Act applies to greenhouse gas pollutants. And it's on that basis that the Obama administration made the commitment to reduce methane through EPA regulation, which I talked about earlier. Okay, and so there is the power under the Federal Clean Air Act to regulate methane, and that is exactly what we're pursuing. The states, meanwhile, are increasingly recognizing that reducing methane emissions is important. And you know, in many states, right, this isn't so much about climate change, right? But when you go out to western states, oftentimes it is about the air pollution that comes along with the methane leaks, right? The state of Wyoming, right, has ozone exceedances that rival California, right, as a result of the industrial activity that's taking place in that rural state from oil and gas development. So they have a local air quality problem that they're trying to address. They don't necessarily want to talk to you about climate change, but they care deeply about their air quality. And so Wyoming is taking many of the steps that we would hope that other states would take, motivated by an effort to clean up the air. Yeah.
As a
Sue.
follow-on to that same topic, obviously our congressional friends in D.C. right now are not the most friendliest place for you to get something done right now. So I can certainly understand why that approach at the state level
Right.
seems to be much more strategically appropriate, considering the environment that we're in right now. So you mentioned earlier the success in Colorado, which is awesome. Mentioned that Pennsylvania looks ripe. What other states are you focusing on that you think are the best candidates for short-term progress? Or if the answer is better on a worldwide, what other countries are you targeting?
Sure. Well, it's really a question. So first of all, so the question is, what other states, right, should we be focusing in on? So first of all, let me just say, we very much believe it is both a federal and state. In fact, the way the Clean Air Act works is that many of the federal initiatives will require state cooperation for implementation. So it's always, working both the federal and state level. Specifically, though, which state you go to depends in part on which part of the value chain present the greatest opportunities. You here in California, okay, there's a whole lot of gas production in California, a lot of oil production, not much gas production per se, okay, but there is a lot of gas distribution infrastructure in the state of California, pipelines that crisscross the state, the stuff that's running underneath the city, the town streets in your homes, towns, okay. We were successful in getting legislation passed this session of the legislature that will require the Public Service Commission and the California Air Resources Board now to implement requirements to accelerate leak detection and repair for that part of the infrastructure, for the distribution infrastructure, right? Likewise, in the state of New York, we've been working with Con Edison to take this mapping technology that we've developed, right, which gives you a sense as to where the leaks are and how big they are, and turn that into a tool that the utilities can use to improve and to accelerate how they do leak detection or repair on their system. And we're now doing that with Con Edison at the direction of the New York State Public Service Commission, who's very interested in accelerating. So, like I said, this is not simply about just getting at the well site, right? This is about the entire value chain. And what we're finding is that different states present different opportunities, and we look for those opportunities and take them as we can create them.
And I'll just add one quick thought to this. I've always got to show the science, the lever here works too. On that Con Ed work, one of the things we've seen from the work we've been doing on local distribution, by understanding the distribution of the size of the leaks, you could repair the same number of leaks as they currently do. We hope they were going to repair more, and triple, get 3 times the reduction by focusing on the larger leaks, which historically they have not done, not just Con Ed, across the industry. We're also working here in California. We've said both with Southern Cal Gas, we're in the process of mapping some of the area around Los Angeles, and we'll be releasing maps as we have for other cities when those are complete. So we're doing this across the country, and it's all towards this: how do we improve the actual operations and reduce those emissions?
One of the things, just to add one last thing, one of the things that we've learned through our science work, frankly, is that for all the attention the well sites get, and even for all the attention the utilities get, because of course we've had some unfortunate accidents as well, the parts of the value chain that have received relatively little attention and yet may be an important source of emissions are the transmission and gathering and processing infrastructure, right? The pipes that run from these wells to the interstate pipeline system are very poorly, frankly, very poorly regulated. In fact, we don't have a national map of that infrastructure. We don't even know all of the infrastructure that exists. And you'll see that this is going to be an increasingly part of our advocacy work in the coming years, is focusing on that, what we call that midstream infrastructure.
We have a web question. Sorry. We'll just...
another question from Ed Norton. Which is the bigger source of methane, natural gas producers or oil well flaring?
Well, the the flaring in the oil fields is not as big a source of methane. It creates pollutants because you're burning it. Now, it's not 100% efficient, and one of the issues is how efficient it is. So it is still a source of methane, but the bulk of that methane. Now, it's wasted resource and added pollution, so there's lots of reasons that we don't want to flare. It's a bad idea, and there are efforts to dramatically reduce the amount of flaring that is currently happening, and Mark can speak to state law, because most of the states now have regulations regarding that.
And that'll be a feature, we think that that'll be a feature both of what EPA proposes, as well as the Bureau of Land Management, right? The Bureau of Land Management is responsible for all of the oil and gas production on federal lands. And their take on this, again, right, isn't so much from an environmental or air quality standpoint, but they're charged with making sure that whatever is produced on federal lands isn't wasted. So every time we send gas to a flare, okay, that's America's energy resources that are not being put to productive use. Bureau of Land Management has something to say about that. And so their regulations will focus on waste, which will have a profound impact on the amount of product that we don't vent into the air or needlessly burn.
So we had a question in the room?
Yeah, on the international scene,
Yes.
what other countries are doing similar kind of science as you are doing that you can leverage off or collaborate with?
So actually, and this is not to be boastful, but actually right now there is no comparable effort happening internationally. So the amount of work that's going on here in the U.S., there is some work in England, there are a few small studies going on, but the level of focus in the U.S. on understanding these emissions across the supply chain is not being replicated. And that's one of the things we're hoping to do, is to help catalyze that, both by bringing greater focus, but also the federal government reaching out. We're also working, as Mark mentioned, on remote sensing. So how much can we do from the satellites with sensors? It's a complicated problem. It's not a straightforward one because you're doing something from way up in space. You lose some of the resolution. But also by making sure, so all the studies we're doing are published in high-level peer-reviewed journals. We're sharing that with the scientific community. The idea is that we want this to be replicated. We want constant improvement. I mean, these aren't the end of the conversation. These are the beginning of the conversation. There's more to be learned. But we do think by showing clear methods for getting these results that others will start to take that up. And we are having conversations. But regrettably, we don't have comparable data sets in other parts of the world. And places where we can do that kind of work, like in North America and Mexico and Canada, it's possible to do it, but clearly there are parts of the world where having teams on the ground looking, having planes flying over, because we get FAA approvals and we do low flight aircraft and things, making measurements, scientists and planes. It's not possible in lots of parts.
But I have presented this work to the International Gas Union Conference in Copenhagen in September. EDF sponsored a workshop in China on shale gas development and the environmental issues. So we did, and our China office has been working quite closely with both the Environment and Energy Ministry in China. So the Chinese are beginning to understand this issue and are showing some interest in it. And of course, I'll be going back to China as part of a delegation, the International Energy Agency, right? And we hope to get them engaged. So
we've done briefings here and shown them work that we're doing. Yeah. So we're very open to sharing. I have one on the web and then one in the room.
This is a question from William Calfee. I'm often talking with a group about climate change. What can I tell individuals that they can do now to make a difference with methane issue?
So with methane, the main thing is waste, which of course as an individual you can't do as much about. I'm trying to think.
Well, here, I'll give you a suggestion. Okay, Steve said before that, we did this work up in Boston, right? And a 2.7% leak rate. Okay, now we think that some of that is coming from Boston's old pipes, but we think, frankly, that some of it is coming from end users. Now, we don't know if that's commercial end users or industrial end users, but I will tell you, okay, if you have a household gas-fired furnace, okay, and you have not had it tuned up lately, please go get it tuned up, okay? If you have a backyard gas grill, okay, and you occasionally smell a little bit of gas, okay, have your plumber come out and fix the coupling. You'd be surprised, okay, how those little leaks, just like a drip at your faucet, right, can add up to a lot of water loss over time. These little leaks at your couplings or from your furnace, okay, can, we think, probably make a big difference, although this is more anecdotal at this point. I think that, please.
So Mark's great. You're absolutely right. And we are in the process of teeing up some research to actually quantify these issues, but there's no doubt that particularly in the Northeast or in heating environments in the northern tier of the U.S., that boilers and furnaces in people's homes are part of the problem. I can't tell you what proportion, but they clearly do emit methane, unburned gas, basically, if you're using natural gas. And so keeping your they're referred to as appliances, not the kind of we normally refer to, but your hot water tank or anything that's using natural gas in the basement or in the utility space, properly tuned is critically important. And we hope in a fairly quick time we'll have some numbers so we can actually quantify how important that issue is. Yeah?
Is this working its way into the curriculum, what the kids are being taught? Say a petroleum engineering degree at Colorado School of Mines or Stanford or OU or...
Yes, so there's more, so we have large numbers, so I mentioned how many people have been involved in these different 16 studies. There's now a whole series of studies that we're not coordinating that are sort of building on this. There are graduate students all over the country at universities, here at Stanford, at Carnegie Mellon, at Washington State University, at Harvard. The work that was done in Boston, that paper that came out, that was a graduate student who was the lead author on that. So there are graduate students now who are looking at these issues and are part of the research teams. And there'll be a whole new generation of people who have thought about this as a systems problem and an environmental problem, and they can bring their technical expertise in a way that had not in the single piece of it, but thinking about the whole system and how do we ensure that we operate these critically important systems to our way of life, but at the same time making sure they have greater integrity so we're getting the benefits without the disbenefits.
On a related point, we are funding a project now that is jointly sponsored by the Colorado School of Mines, I think Colorado State University, one other university, that actually is now providing training to field inspectors for a series of oil and gas related issues, right? We've created a Inspectors Academy, okay? And that's not only going to help create more knowledgeable inspectors in the field, but of course all of the academics and graduate students that contributed to development to that curriculum are themselves now tuned up, so to speak.
Yeah.
We're shooting for this low leakage rate. That's the aim here.
Correct.
So in the studies that you've done to date, have there been any pleasant or disturbing surprises with regard to that? Or what have been the...
Right. Great question. Sort of what is the leak rates we've observed, and to what degree they are lower than we expected, and to what degree are they higher than we expected? And I'm going to give the unsatisfying answer of yes and yes. So we have seen in some segments lower components like reduced emission completions. You do what the EPA regs require you to do, so when you burp this well, you sort of get it started, you are 98% efficient in capturing that methane. That's a really good news story. That's great. It really works. The technology works. We've clearly seen in some of the flyover studies that there are multiple times more methane coming from thermogenic, from geologic sources, than you would estimate using EPA data. What we are now working on and about to release is a study where we pulled all that together to compare and contrast and see what the sort of how these methods all compare, and then synthesize it into a national emissions effort. I regret I can't give you the bottom line. Part of that is because some of it has not yet been published, and we have a rule that we don't, until it's been vetted by peer review and gotten everybody to take pot shots and make sure it's solid, we don't talk about it. The second part is the full synthesis is ongoing. So we're pulling all this data together to come up with a sort of bottom line set of conclusions. That's ongoing as we speak. I leave this meeting literally to have a phone call about that issue.
But I will tell you that almost universally what our studies show is that a small percentage of sources that we survey are responsible for a significant fraction of the emissions we see, right? Super emitters, we call it fat tail. Okay, and a lot of it has to do with this, what I'll call these operation and maintenance issues. And we know we have anecdotes when the guys go out to do the emissions measurements on site, they find that there are, hatches that are left open, valves that are stuck open. Companies can fix these things very easily, but if it weren't for the fact that we're on site doing the emissions measurements, it may not have been detected.
And just to Mark's point, it's not just at the production end. This is across the entire supply chain, including the local distribution. We know that characteristic is true. And we know that we can now basically come up without this dissonance between the different methods. We can start to balance the methane budget. And we will, over the next few months, be releasing with our academic partners what those rates look like. But most importantly is always to remember, it's not about what they are today. It's about what they could be tomorrow and how much this knowledge allows us to identify those. And with consistently across the board, what we see is there are solutions in place, technologies available. So without exception, either a large percentage or a majority of sites across the supply chain are operating well.
So unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you've enjoyed the hour, we have to end it here, okay? But Steve and I, for those of you who are in the room, Steve and I are here for a few minutes and can take any questions from in the room. For those of you who are on the phone, first of all, thank you for joining us, and thank you to the folks here for joining us. And of course, we're always available to you. I think that there's information, contact information that's made available. Steve and I are happy to field questions, and please, we're constantly publishing on our blog, Energy Exchange, our work and our progress. So please, keep in touch with us that way as well.
Thanks very much.